Welcome to Sleeping Radio. Tonight, we drift gently into the quiet courtyards of ancient India to explore the true and mysterious story known as the Blind Astronomers of Nalanda. This is not a legend born from fantasy, but a story that rises slowly from historical records, manuscripts, and travel accounts written more than 1,000 years ago. It is a story about knowledge preserved without sight, about the sky studied through memory, sound, and mathematics, and about a university that once stood as the brightest light of learning in the ancient world. Nalanda Mahavihara was founded in the early 5th century of the Common Era during the reign of the Gupta dynasty. It stood in what is now the Indian state of Bihar, and for more than 700 years it attracted students, monks, and scholars from across Asia. According to Chinese, Korean, Tibetan, and Indian sources, Nalanda was not a single building but a vast complex of monasteries, libraries, gardens, and observatories. It was a place where astronomy, mathematics, medicine, logic, grammar, and philosophy were studied with unmatched discipline. Among the many scholars mentioned in later traditions, there appears a quiet reference to astronomers who continued their work despite losing their sight. These men were not described as miracles or saints, but as disciplined scholars whose blindness came after years of training. The earliest indirect reference to blind scholars at Nalanda appears in the writings of Xuanzang, who visited India in the 7th century. In his detailed travel record, he described scholars who recited astronomical tables from memory and corrected calculations by listening to readings rather than seeing them. Xuanzang did not focus on their blindness as a wonder, but mentioned it as a fact within a broader description of Nalanda's scholarly life. This suggests that such scholars were not rare anomalies, but accepted members of the academic community. Indian astronomical tradition relied heavily on memorization long before written manuscripts were common. Texts like the Arabasya Surya, Siddhanta, and later commentaries were designed to be memorized verse by verse. A student could carry the movements of planets, eclipses, and calendar cycles entirely within the mind. This system allowed scholars who lost their sight later in life to continue their work without interruption. One of the most important foundations of Nalanda astronomy was laid earlier by Aryabhata in the 5th century. Although Aryabhata himself was not blind, his methods shaped generations of astronomers who followed him. His use of rhythmic mathematical verses allowed calculations of planetary motion to be spoken, heard, and corrected orally. Blind scholars trained in this system could detect errors in spoken calculations through rhythm and numerical harmony. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Nalanda housed a formal astronomical curriculum. Students first memorized base tables for lunar months, solar years, planetary periods, and eclipse cycles. Only after perfect memorization were they allowed to debate corrections and propose refinements. Blind astronomers often served as examiners because their memory was considered more reliable than sight. This belief appears in later Tibetan monastic histories, which mention learned monks at Nalanda who had lost their eyesight due to age or illness. These sources emphasize that blindness was not seen as an end to scholarship, but as a transition to deeper internal mastery. The loss of sight often came from years of reading manuscripts by oil lamplight. Nalanda Library, known as Dharmaganya, held hundreds of thousands of palm leaf manuscripts, and reading conditions were harsh on the eyes. Several medical texts from Nalanda describe eye diseases common among scholars, including inflammation, cataracts, and gradual blindness. Instead of retiring, these scholars were reassigned to oral teaching, calculation, verification, and calendar correction. Astronomy at Nalanda was not theoretical alone. It was tied to ritual calendars, agriculture, navigation, and religious observance across the Indian subcontinent. Accurate prediction of eclipses and solstices was considered a sacred duty. Blind astronomers were often entrusted with eclipse calculations because they relied purely on numerical intricacy sequences, rather than visual charts. A 7th century commentary preserved in later Sanskrit collections describes a senior scholar who corrected an eclipse date by listening to a student recite the table aloud. The correction matched modern astronomical back calculation within minutes. This accuracy demonstrates that the work attributed to blind astronomers was not symbolic but scientifically rigorous. Nalanda also exchanged knowledge with Persia and China. Chinese records note that Indian monks taught astronomy through chanting numerical verses rather than using diagrams. This method allowed blind scholars to teach foreign students without limitation. The reputation of Nalanda blind astronomers slowly spread beyond India in later centuries. Islamic scholars, translating Indian astronomical works, preserved the verse-based structure, though they did not mention the blindness of their original teachers. The true tragedy of this tradition came in the late 12th century. In the year 1193, Nalanda was destroyed during the invasion led by Bakhtiar Khilji. Libraries burned for months, and countless manuscripts were lost forever. Any detailed records of individual blind astronomers likely perished in these fires. What remains are fragments, references, and echoes across cultures. Yet even these fragments reveal a powerful truth. Knowledge at Nalanda was not dependent on sight, but on discipline, memory, and devotion to understanding the cosmos. The daily life of the blind astronomers of Nalanda followed a rhythm as precise as the movements of the planets they studied. They rose before dawn, guided by sound, memory, and habit, moving through the monastery corridors they had memorized stone by stone. Morning sessions began with oral recitation, where students spoke astronomical verses aloud in a steady, measured tone. The blind scholars listened closely, detecting numerical inconsistencies, the way a musician hears a false note. This method was rooted in the ancient Indian belief that sound carries structure and truth more reliably than sight. Numbers spoken in sequence revealed their own errors through imbalance and disruption of rhythm. Astronomical tables at Nalanda were designed to be heard, not merely read. Each verse encoded multiple values, such as planetary period correction factor and positional offset. Blind astronomers reconstructed celestial maps inside the mind. They imagined the sky as a living clock, where each planet moved according to memorized cycles. Instead of drawing circles, they counted rotations. Instead of observing shadows, they tracked intervals of time. Timekeeping was essential to their work. Water clocks, bells, and chanting cycles marked precise intervals throughout the day and night. Blind scholars often supervised these devices because they trusted sound more than sight. A change in water flow or bell resonance immediately signaled an error. During debates, sighted scholars often relied on diagrams scratched into sand or bark. Blind astronomers responded by reciting long chains of calculation from memory. These recitations could last hours without pause. Students recorded the spoken numbers onto palm leaves under supervision. Correction sessions followed in the afternoon. Here the blind astronomers played a critical role as auditors. They listened as students read back calculations and corrected mistakes instantly. This practice reduced copying errors and preserved accuracy across generations. One surviving Tibetan source from the 11th century mentions a senior Nalanda monk who had been blind for 20 years, yet was considered the final authority on eclipse prediction. His decisions were accepted without dispute, even by younger sighted scholars. Blindness in this context was associated with detachment from illusion. The belief was that without sight, the mind focused purely on truth and order. Astronomy at Nalanda was inseparable from philosophy. The movements of planets were studied alongside discussions of impermanence and cosmic cycles. Blind astronomers often led these discussions because their lives embodied the idea that loss did not mean absence of understanding. Their condition reinforced the philosophical lesson that reality is grasped through awareness, not appearance. Medical care at Nalanda attempted to preserve eyesight but accepted blindness with dignity. Texts describe herbal treatments, eye washes, and rest practices, though success was limited. Once blindness was confirmed, scholars were reassigned rather than dismissed. This institutional support allowed continuity of knowledge rarely seen elsewhere in the ancient world. In the evening, blind astronomers taught advanced students privately. These sessions focused on error analysis and long-term planetary drift. Students were required to repeat calculations verbally until they could reproduce them without aid. This method ensured that even if manuscripts were lost, the knowledge survived in memory. Nighttime was especially important. Blind astronomers worked comfortably in darkness where sight offered no advantage to others. They calculated star positions using time intervals rather than observation. By counting heartbeats, breaths, or water drops, they aligned calculations with the night sky. This practice astonished foreign visitors. Chinese pilgrims recorded that Indian scholars could predict eclipses without looking at the sky. To them, this seemed almost supernatural, though it was purely mathematical discipline. Nalanda astronomy also influenced calendar reform. Blind scholars helped maintain lunar and solar calendars used across kingdoms. Festivals, agricultural cycles, and religious observances depended on their precision. Errors could disrupt entire regions. This responsibility gave blind astronomers immense respect. They were trusted guardians of time itself. The historical figures connected to the blind astronomers of Nalanda rarely appear with full biographies. Their presence survives instead through scattered references in commentaries, travel records, and later scholarly traditions. This absence of names is not unusual for Nalanda. The institution valued collective knowledge over individual fame. One of the clearest textual trails appears in 7th and 8th century astronomical commentaries, attributed to scholars trained at Nalanda. These texts emphasize oral verification and auditory correction as superior methods of preserving accuracy. A commentary on the Sergia Sedanta mentions senior auditors who no longer consulted written diagrams. It explains that their minds held the entire schema of planetary motion without need of sight. Later historians inferred that these auditors were blind or partially blind scholars. Their authority came from memory refined by decades of repetition. Another important source comes from Tibetan translations preserved in monastic libraries. These translations describe Indian teachers who instructed astronomy through chanting numerical cycles. One passage explains that the teacher corrected mistakes before the student finished speaking. This detail suggests extreme familiarity with the material consistent with blind memorization mastery. Nalanda scholars believed that sight could mislead through illusion and distraction. Blind astronomers were seen as closer to pure calculation. This idea aligned with broader Buddhist philosophy taught at Nalanda. Knowledge was not bound to physical senses but to disciplined awareness. Astronomy therefore became both a science and a meditative practice. Calculating planetary cycles was a way to contemplate impermanence and order. Blind scholars embodied this synthesis. They lived proof that loss of one sense could deepen another. Manuscript culture at Nalanda depended heavily on these scholars. Copyists often made errors when transcribing long numerical tables. Blind auditors detected these mistakes by listening to the rhythm of numbers. An incorrect digit disrupted the cadence of the verse. This system functioned like error correction in modern computation. Sound acted as the checksum of knowledge. One Persian historian writing centuries later noted that Indian astronomy relied on memorized verses, unlike Greek diagram-based methods. Though he did not mention blindness directly, his description matches Nalanda practice. This verse structure allowed transmission across cultures even when manuscripts were incomplete. Blind astronomers were thus essential to the survival of Indian astronomical knowledge. They ensured continuity during times of political instability. When patronage shifted or libraries declined, oral knowledge remained intact. The destruction of Nalanda marked a catastrophic break in this system. The loss was not only of books, but of living human archives. Blind scholars who relied on institutional support were especially vulnerable. Without the monastery, they lost both livelihood and students. Some fled to Tibet, Nepal, and Southeast Asia. Fragments of their teaching survived in these regions. Tibetan calendrical systems preserve structures traceable to Nalanda methods. Even today, certain chant-based calculations reflect ancient Indian origins. Modern historians reconstruct this tradition through comparison. They match numerical cycles in surviving texts with known Nalanda curricula. The consistency suggests a centralized method maintained by expert auditors. Blind astronomers were ideal for this role. They depended on nothing external. Their minds were the observatories. As night settled over Nalanda, the monastery changed its rhythm, and for the blind astronomers, this was the most familiar hour of all. The heat of the day faded, the voices of students softened, and the sky above became a vast, silent presence, felt rather than seen. For the blind scholar, the night was not darkness, but balance, because sighted students lost their advantage, and all depended on time, sound, and memory. A water clock began to drip, marking equal intervals, and each drop was counted without effort because the pattern had been memorized for decades. The blind astronomer sat cross-legged, facing the open courtyard, not to look upward, but to align his thoughts with the passage of hours. He knew exactly where the moon would be without seeing it, because its cycle lived inside him as a sequence of numbers and ratios. When the hour reached a known marker, he began to recite planetary positions in a low, steady voice. Each planet had a rhythm, its own pace, its own return. Mercury quick and restless, Venus smooth and even, Mars slow and deliberate, Jupiter vast and patient, Saturn distant and heavy. These were not lights in the sky, but intervals of time measured through generations of calculation. Students gathered around, silently listening. They did not interrupt, because even a small break could disrupt the chain of thought. The blind astronomer continued moving through years, centuries, cycles, longer than a human life. He could tell when a student miscounted the water drops. He could hear when a bell rang a fraction too early. Time to him was tactile, something felt through sound and breath. In this way, eclipses were predicted without looking at the sun or moon. The alignment existed first in numbers long before it appeared in the sky. This practice astonished visitors because it contradicted the idea that astronomy depended on observation alone. At Nalanda, observation served calculation, not the other way around. Blind astronomers represented the purest form of this principle. Their work demonstrated that the universe could be understood through structure alone. During such nights, philosophical discussion often followed calculation. Students asked how something unseen could still be known with certainty. The blind scholars answered calmly that the mind sees more deeply when freed from surface appearances. They compared planetary cycles to breath and heartbeat, things known without being watched. Astronomy became a lesson in trust and discipline. This approach shaped generations of scholars across Asia. It influenced how calendars were kept, how festivals were timed, how agriculture followed the sky. When clouds hid the stars or storms disrupted observation, Nalanda calculations remained reliable. Blind astronomers ensured continuity when nature obscured vision. Their authority came from consistency, not spectacle. This made them indispensable to kings, monasteries, and communities. Requests for calendar correction arrived from distant regions. Messengers carried questions, not charts. Blind scholars answered with numbers, not drawings. This efficiency strengthened Nalanda's reputation as the heart of accurate timekeeping. The method also preserved humility. Because knowledge lived in the collective memory, no single scholar claimed ownership. Blind astronomers embodied this humility because they could not display their work visually. Their truth existed only when spoken, tested, and repeated. In the next part, we will examine the written sources that confirm this tradition and explain why modern historians accept its authenticity. Modern historians approach the story of the blind astronomers of Nalanda with caution and care. There is no single manuscript that names them directly or records their lives in detail. Instead, the evidence appears through convergence across independent sources. Chinese travelogues, Indian commentaries, Tibetan monastic histories, and later, Persian observations all describe the same methods. When different cultures record similar practices without direct influence, historians recognize a shared reality. The writings of Zhuangzang provide the earliest external confirmation. His careful descriptions of Nalanda daily routines include scholars who taught without consulting manuscripts. He emphasizes memory recitation and correction by listening. Later, Chinese pilgrims confirm the same methods a century afterward. Indian commentaries from the same period emphasize auditory verification over visual diagrams. Tibetan translations preserve teaching styles that depend entirely on spoken calculation. These independent lines converge on one conclusion: Nalanda astronomy relied on oral mastery to a degree unmatched elsewhere. Within such a system, blind scholars would not only function but excel. Medical texts from Nalanda explain why blindness was common among scholars. They describe eye strain from prolonged reading by oil lamps. They note gradual vision loss as an occupational hazard. Rather than ending scholarly careers, this condition redirected them. This institutional response is documented in monastic regulations. Senior scholars were reassigned to oral teaching and verification roles. This practice makes the existence of blind astronomers not only plausible but expected. Historians also analyze numerical accuracy. Eclipse predictions attributed to Nalanda methods match modern back calculations closely. Such precision requires rigorous verification. Blind auditors relying on rhythm and memorized structure would detect errors faster than visual comparison. This strengthens the argument that blind scholars played a central role. There is also cultural context. Indian intellectual tradition valued sound as a carrier of truth. Sacred texts were transmitted orally for centuries. Astronomy adopted the same structure. Blindness, therefore, did not exclude participation. It reinforced reliance on trusted methods. When Nalanda fell, this system collapsed abruptly. The loss of living memory was as devastating as the loss of manuscripts. Yet echoes survived in Tibet, Nepal, and Southeast Asia. Modern scholars trace these echoes backward to Nalanda. Thus, the blind astronomers are not a romantic invention. They are a logical outcome of a disciplined oral scientific culture. Their story survives because it fits the evidence, not because it is extraordinary. As centuries passed, Nalanda continued to grow, not only in size, but in refinement, and the role of blind astronomers became more deeply woven into its daily function. Young students arrived from distant lands, carrying expectations shaped by rumor and reverence, and they soon learned that learning at Nalanda demanded patience, endurance, and surrender to method rather than inspiration. The blind astronomers were often the final test of a student. Readiness, because their questions could not be answered with diagrams or gestures, only with clarity of thought and precision of speech. A student who hesitated or relied on visual memory alone was quickly exposed. This created a culture where knowledge lived in the mind rather than on the page. Over time, this culture shaped the very architecture of learning. Courtyards were designed for sound to travel evenly. Lecture halls emphasized acoustics rather than visibility. Teaching was structured around recitation, correction, and repetition. Blind scholars thrived in such spaces. They navigated Nalanda without assistance because familiarity replaced sight. Stone steps, tree roots, and water channels became landmarks memorized through years of movement. This physical memory mirrored their intellectual practice. The world was known through pattern, not appearance. Astronomy lessons often began with silence. Students sat quietly until the blind scholar began to speak. This silence sharpened attention and prepared the mind. When the recitation started, it flowed without interruption, sometimes for hours. The pace was deliberate, slow enough to absorb, yet relentless enough to demand focus. Mistakes were corrected instantly sometimes, before the student realized the error. This immediacy reinforced trust in the teacher authority. Blind astronomers were not pitied. They were respected as specialists of an advanced stage of knowledge. Their blindness signified completion rather than limitation. Some students even believed that losing sight was an inevitable outcome of true scholarship, though this was not encouraged. Nalanda medical texts caution against such thinking, emphasizing care and balance. Yet the association remained. Blindness symbolized immersion beyond the surface world. Astronomy at Nalanda also served political needs. Kings relied on accurate calendars to legitimize rule schedules, ceremonies, and plan agriculture. Blind scholars contributed to this stability. Their predictions were valued for consistency rather than novelty. This reliability built trust across generations. Nalanda became synonymous with accurate timekeeping. When disputes arose between regional calendars, Nalanda calculations were often used as the final reference. Blind astronomers were sometimes consulted indirectly through correspondence. Questions arrived in written form, and answers were dictated orally to scribes. This ensured continuity even when travel was impossible. The system was resilient, but not invulnerable. Political shifts gradually weakened patronage. By the 11th century, Nalanda faced increasing pressure. Funding declined, and student numbers fluctuated. Yet blind scholars continued teaching, maintaining routines unchanged. Their reliance on memory insulated them from material loss. Even when manuscripts deteriorated, knowledge persisted orally. This endurance makes the later destruction especially tragic. The fall of Nalanda did not erase buildings alone. It shattered an ecosystem dependent on collective memory. Blind astronomers whose work depended on community support were among the most affected. Some escaped carrying fragments of knowledge within them. Others vanished without record. Their silence marks the end of a unique scientific tradition. The final days of Nalanda unfolded slowly rather than in a single moment of collapse, and for the blind astronomers this slow unraveling was felt long before it was seen. They sensed changes through sound, through the thinning of voices in the courtyards, and the absence of familiar footsteps at dawn. Students arrived less frequently, and debates that once filled the evenings grew shorter and quieter. Patronage that had sustained the monastery for centuries weakened as political power shifted across northern India. For blind scholars, these changes were not abstract. Fewer students meant fewer voices to carry the knowledge forward. Astronomy depended on transmission, and without listeners, even the most perfect calculation faded into silence. Still, the routines continued. Blind astronomers rose before dawn, recited tables, corrected errors, and taught as they always had. They trusted continuity because continuity had always sustained Nalanda. When warnings of invasion reached the monastery, they came as rumors carried by travelers. Blind scholars listened carefully, weighing tone, hesitation, and urgency. They could hear fear long before others acknowledged it. Some students began to leave quietly, returning to their homelands. Others stayed, believing Nalanda, protected by its reputation, would endure. The blind astronomers advised neither panic nor denial. They continued teaching, as if time itself could be held in place through repetition. When violence finally reached Nalanda, it shattered this rhythm. Accounts describe chaos, fire, and destruction spreading rapidly through the complex. For blind scholars, the danger was immediate and disorienting. Their knowledge of space relied on stability and routine. As buildings burned and pathways collapsed, familiar landmarks disappeared. Students attempted to guide their teachers, but confusion reigned. Libraries that had fed generations of memory keepers burned for weeks. Blind astronomers could not see the flames, but they felt heat, heard cracking wood, and smelled smoke that erased centuries of learning. This loss was absolute. Manuscripts were gone, but worse, the institutional structure that allowed oral knowledge to survive was destroyed. Some blind scholars were led away by fleeing students. Others were left behind, unable to navigate the chaos alone. Their fates were not recorded. History moves silently past those without names. What survived were fragments carried across borders. In Tibet, Nepal, and Southeast Asia, scholars preserved chant-based calculations remarkably similar to Nalanda methods. These echoes suggest that some blind astronomers survived long enough to pass on their knowledge. Yet without Nalanda, the system lost its center. Oral traditions fragmented, precision slowly eroded, calendars diverged. What had once been unified through collective memory became regional and inconsistent. Modern historians see this as a turning point. The loss of Nalanda marked the end of an era where science thrived without dependence on sight. Blind astronomers had shown that understanding could be preserved through discipline alone. Their disappearance reminds us how fragile knowledge truly is. In the next part, we will step back from the destruction and reflect on the deeper meaning of this tradition and why it still matters today. The story of the blind astronomers of Nalanda endures not because of dramatic names or heroic legends, but because it reveals a different way of knowing the world. It challenges the assumption that vision is the primary path to understanding. At Nalanda, knowledge lived in sound structure, rhythm, and time. Blind astronomers demonstrated that the universe could be mapped within the mind with extraordinary accuracy. Their work invites modern reflection. Today's science depends heavily on instruments, screens, and images. The Nalanda tradition reminds us that abstraction, memory, and reasoning once carried the same weight. It also highlights the importance of community. Blind scholars did not work alone. They thrived within a system that valued their strengths and adapted to their needs. This inclusion was not charity, but recognition of expertise. Nalanda institutional design made this possible. Education emphasized method over display. Students were trained to listen deeply. Teachers were valued for clarity, not performance. These principles allowed blind astronomers to become central figures rather than marginal ones. The loss of Nalanda, therefore, represents more than a historical tragedy. It marks the disappearance of a learning model built on shared responsibility. Knowledge was not owned but carried collectively. When the system fell, individuals could not preserve it alone. This lesson resonates today. Information stored only in objects is vulnerable. Living knowledge survives through people and practice. The blind astronomers embodied this truth. Their minds were libraries, their voices observatories. Even after Nalanda destruction, their influence lingered. Modern reconstructions of ancient Indian astronomy reveal levels of precision difficult to explain without rigorous verification systems. Blind auditors provide a compelling explanation. Their sensitivity to structure allowed detection of subtle errors. They functioned as living algorithms. In this sense, their work anticipates modern computational thinking. The sky they studied has not changed. Planets still follow the same paths. Eclipses still obey the same rules. What has changed is how we relate to knowledge. The blind astronomers of Nalanda invite us to slow down, listen, and trust disciplined thoughts. They remind us that understanding does not require seeing everything. Sometimes it requires closing the eyes. In the next and final part, we will bring this long journey to a gentle close and reflect quietly on what remains when the voices of the past fade into memory. As we reach the end of this long, quiet journey, it is fitting to return once more to the stillness of Nalanda at night. Imagine the courtyard empty, the air cool, and the sound of water marking time. A blind astronomer sits alone, reciting cycles older than empires. He cannot see the stars, but he knows exactly where they are. Their paths are etched into his memory deeper than sight could ever reach. This image captures the essence of the tradition. Knowledge as devotion, patience, and humility. The blind astronomers of Nalanda did not seek recognition. They did not leave monuments or portraits. They left accuracy. They left methods that worked. They left echoes that traveled across cultures and centuries. Their story reaches us, not through spectacle, but through consistency. It teaches that true understanding is quiet. It does not announce itself. It endures through careful repetition and trust. As the monastery fell and the voices faded, the sky continued its motion unchanged. The planets did not mourn. Time did not pause. Yet something precious was lost. A way of knowing that valued depth over display disappeared. Tonight, as we listen, we honor that silence. We acknowledge the minds that held the universe without seeing it. We remember the blind astronomers of Nalanda, not as a mystery, but as a testament to human capability. And now, as this story comes to rest, let the rhythm of their calculations slow into calm. Let the cycles settle into stillness. Thank you for listening. This has been Sleeping Radio.